Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti. I am MrPhotographer.com. In this video, we're going to talk about a mistake I see people make in Lightroom all the time and how to avoid it. That mistake is haloing. I'll be paging through Instagram and I see this a lot. A lot of times I'll see a beautiful image, but often you'll see haloing. And this most often is when you have a high contrast edge. In this case, it's this post against the bright sky, and you can see there's haloing around it. And it could go the other way around as well. You could have something light, like a light, like flagpole or something, going up into a dark sky, and you'll get haloing as well. Well, it's actually kind of easy to avoid, and part of it is in-camera issues, and part of it is Lightroom. Talk about the Lightroom part first. In this case here, you could see that we have the haloing along these some of these posts here. It's not as bad there, but it is definitely an issue. And most often that is because people are just a little bit too friendly with the clarity and contrast sliders in Lightroom. And if I zoom in on this, you can see I have clarity on this one at plus 71, which is kind of ridiculously high. And if I start to bring that down, zero it out, you could see it lessened the haloing. And the same thing with contrast. If I zero that out, then you could see the haloing is pretty much gone. And to me, actually, the image looks much better. But that is the main issue. People are just pushing clarity and contrast way too high, causing that issue. But there is an issue in camera as well. If I give you a before after this image, you'll notice there's before. The image is really underexposed. And this is a really old image of mine. I think this image might be 7 or 8 years old. And obviously, I was doing a long exposure. I don't remember the exact details. I was using an ND filter, I would imagine. And I miscalculated for whatever reason, and I didn't give it enough exposure. And this is where you'll find the issue most often happen. You could see I had to take the exposure slider and move it up to 2.3 stops of positive exposure. So I had to really brighten up the image. And this is when you'll often see the issue. So you really could help this out if you get it correct in camera. Many times, though, our camera gets fooled by the scene. There's just odd lighting in the scene, or in this case, a long exposure, whatever it was. Something is just in the scene causing the camera to underexpose for whatever reason. What I suggest you do is, in odd light, take an exposure off the palm of your hand. This used to be a super popular trick we did in the days of film, but I don't see anyone talking about it much in digital photography. But if you're in a really odd lighting situation, take an exposure reading with your camera off the palm of your hand. And it doesn't matter what mode you're in. Let's say you're in Aperture Priority Mode. Set up your aperture the way you want it to be set up. Take the exposure reading off the palm of your hand and see what it would be. And then when you're going to shoot the entire scene, switch over to manual mode and put in those settings. So if you were in Aperture Priority Mode shooting at f8 and you're at ISO 100, take a reading off the palm of your hand to see what your shutter speed will be. Let's say it's going to give you 1/125th of a second. Well then, set up your camera in manual mode at 1/125th of a second, f8, ISO 100, and take a shot. If it's a little underexposed, then add a little more exposure. You could do that with a slower shutter speed or a bigger aperture. On the other hand, if it's a little bit overexposed, use a little less exposure. What I'm trying to say is our skin tone isn't a perfect gray card. That is what your camera is going to expose for, middle gray. And since everyone's skin tone is different, you have to kind of get an idea what your palm skin tone is compared to middle gray. And then actually you could use that forever. For example, if I take a meter reading off the palm of my hand and I get the settings and I put my camera in manual mode and take a shot, and my image is underexposed, and I add, let's say, maybe 2/3 of a stop of exposure compensation. I could do that with the exposure compensation dial or setting on my camera, or as I mentioned, I could just change the aperture or shutter speed. But once I do that, that is probably forever, meaning my skin tone is always 2/3 of a stop different from what the true exposure should be. So I could always, going forward, take an exposure reading off the palm of my hand and know that I have to add 2/3 stops of exposure compensation, positive exposure compensation, to correctly expose the scene. So I hope that made sense. If it didn't, don't worry. In the description below this video, I'll write out step-by-step instructions and how you could do that so that you could better expose the scene. Now, in an image like this, sometimes you will expose the scene properly, more or less, but because you have strong backlighting, in the case of a sunset, you will sometimes get haloing as well. There's something you could do in Lightroom to help for that. If you look here, I have clarity at +44 and I have contrast at +31. And if I take clarity all the way down and I take contrast all the way down, if you look very carefully here, you could see there's just still a little bit of haloing, and that is because it's strongly backlit. So really, even if you got this correct in camera, you would often have an issue as well, and we'll reset that. So we have our image reset, and you can see it isn't drastically underexposed like the previous image, but we're still getting that haloing. What I suggest you do if you have this situation is go to the tone curve and make sure you're in the point curve. There's two different curves in Lightroom. This is the region curve, and if you click on this little square, you'll toggle between that and the point curve. So make sure you're in the point curve, put a point right in the middle, and push it up like this, towards this corner over here. And what you're doing is now we're actually just adding exposure to the image. Then we could go to the basic tab, and then we could bring shadows down if we want, bring highlights down. So we could darken it here with these settings, and we'll avoid the haloing that way. So we could come in here, and I'll just do it super fast. So we could avoid this haloing issue that we had prior. So I could bring saturation up. Then if it is still maybe a little dark in the shadows, let's say I could go this way with the shadows. I could even go to this exposure slider and move that around. But what you want to do is just do everything you can to avoid that haloing down in here. And that, what I found, is will help quite a bit, especially with these backlit images. So really the mistake is with Lightroom is just too much clarity and too much contrast. And you can see I could pop the clarity up, and we could go too high and you'll start seeing that haloing come back. So just be very careful with clarity and with contrast, and you should avoid most of the instances where you're getting that haloing. On the other hand, if your image is really underexposed, do what I told you about those tricky exposure situations and take a meter reading off the palm of your hand, and then compensate your exposure from there. And I think you'll find that your images will be exposed better overall. I hope that made sense. Thank you, everyone who watches my videos. I really do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.